In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. This is our second class on the relationship of the Russian Church abroad and the Greek Old Calendar Church. And to help us understand this, we've been going through an article by Subdeacon Nectarius, who's actually a subdeacon in the ROCOR Moscow Patriarchate, but someone who's done a good job actually researching and laying out the historical the chronology and events and opinions of people and so forth that occur in this whole process from the 20s right up through the 60s and eventually into the 90s, and then right up to the time of the unfortunate capitulation of a large part of the Russian Church abroad to the Moscow Patriarchate. So last time we went up through the period of the actual consecrations done by the Russian Church abroad hierarchs in 1960 and 61 and 62, and then the formal statement by the Church abroad hierarchy in 62 under Michel and Anastasi that said that they did not recognize, they could not recognize the canonization, the consecrations as regular. And we're going to, then there's a little, we've stopped there with that statement. And there's a little bit to finish in this section on that period in the early 60s. And then we're going to go on to the next section, which is about the recognition of the Old Calendarists by the ROCOR in 1969 and the events that followed that. And we'll probably finish the article tonight. So let's see how we go. So there's a little bit. So in 62 then, last time we talked about how we read the evidence, the actual transcript almost of the meetings where they debated whether the Archbishop Leonti and the others should be censured for doing this. And finally, they were not censured. And Archbishop Hierarchal and St. John Maximovich stood up for them and said that, in essence, spiritually, this is the right thing to do. Just that in terms of church order, it was not regular. But even in 62, remember, Archbishop Hierarchal was saying, look at the situation we're in. The whole Orthodox Church is in chaos. These jurisdictions, especially the Ecumenical Patriarchate that Michel Anastasi was so concerned about, they're doing widely uncanonical things. And why are we so fastidious about this? Well, we know the Old Calendarists are on our side. We know that they're one spirit with us. And we shouldn't be so legalistic about this. But the official position in 62 was that they did not recognize the consecrations, that they desired to remain in a normal relationship with the State Church of Greece and with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But the author goes on. Although the Synod officially did not accept these consecrations as a whole, that was not what would be said in private by a large majority of the hierarchs, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. There was a majority of them, even though they were obedient to the Metropolitan, the majority of them actually, in private, they tell you they favored the consecrations. The individual members of the Russian Synod that did recognize these ordinations, albeit in private, were St. John Maximovich, Archbishop Hierarchal of Jordanville, Bishop Nectari of Seattle, Bishop Sava of Edmonton, Bishop Anthony of Melbourne, who later became Archbishop Anthony of San Francisco, the successor to St. John. And of course, Bishop Seraphim of Chicago and Seraphim of Caracas and Leonti of Chile, who were consecrators. This private recognition of the consecrations, particularly that of Bishop Petros of Astoria, can be seen by a letter that was written, signed, that is now archived at the Cathedral of St. Marcella. That's our cathedral. In New York. Oh, there it is, in Astoria, New York, which the above bishops, all these bishops, St. John and Hierarchal and Sava and Nectari, and these are holy people. I mean, St. John is a canonized saint, but everybody knows Archbishop Hierarchal and Bishop Nectari, Bishop Sava. These are the spiritual elite of the Russian Church abroad. These are the men noted. These are men noted for their holiness, right? And also I can also add to this number. We know that Archbishop Bishop Philaret of Hamburg, also was very much in favor. And we know that, remember from the previous, early in the article, Bishop Nikon, later Archbishop Nikon of Washington, was sympathetic. And Archbishop Nikon of Washington was a protege and the biographer of Anthony Krapovitsky, You see. So even though his Abba, I think Abovitsky, was back in the 30s, was against the stance of the old calendarists. I mean, he was sympathetic to them, but against their making communion, season commemoration. Archbishop Nikon, by his time, who's a much younger man and lives into the period of full-blown, outrageous ecumenism of the 60s, he has a different viewpoint because things kept changing. The circumstances kept changing. Right. So now we're going to go into the next section of the article, the Synod of St. Philaret of New York and the recognition of the sister churches. So that was 62, now 64. In 1964, at the synodal meeting in New York City, Metropolitan Anastasi announced that he would be retiring due to his ailing health. He was over 90 years old. Right? He was a man born in the 1870s. Right? He was already a veteran hierarch, experienced churchman at the time of the Revolution. Okay, so he's really a living, like a time machine, or a living evidence of that old world, of the pre-revolutionary Russian world. Yeah. So, and it was amazing to know people like this, right? Wonderful man. So he was in his 90s. He's going to be retiring. The Holy Synod elected Bishop Philaret as their new first hierarch to succeed the aging Metropolitan Anastasi. Bishop Philaret was Bishop of Brisbane in Australia. He was one of the junior. I think at the time he might have been, besides, no, this is before Loris was consecrated, so he probably was the most junior bishop at the time. Remember, St. Philaret had been in China for a long time, and then came out, and then with that, large portion of the China, the Manchuria, the Harbin, and the Shanghai, most of the Harbin immigration went to Australia. And Bishop Philaret was with them, right? Quote, the enthronement of Metropolitan Philaret, which took place on Saturday and Sunday, May 1730 to 1831, developed into an unprecedented solemn feast, which left a deep and abiding impression upon all. To a degree perhaps never before experienced by such a multitude, participants in this feast felt themselves engulfed by the grace endowing holy mystery of the Church. Of great influence was the fact that the entire service, both Saturday and Sunday, was, so to say, spiritually imbued with the continuing act of elevation to the head of the Church of the new Metropolitan. That's a quote. I imagine that's from Pravoslavia Rus, or let's see. Oh, I didn't print out the footnotes. So I have to look in the article for the footnotes. But that's from one of the contemporary church periodicals of the time. Now, I don't think the author points out. The author does not even mention that St. John Maximovich handpicked Metropolitan Philaret. The election was disputed between two candidates, and St. John, I think St. John was one of the candidates. He withdrew his candidacy, and he said we should elect Bishop Philaret. So when people say, well, Vladika John Maximovich was not an extremist, he wasn't far right like Philaret. And he would have gone along with the Union of the Moscow Patriarchate and all this stuff. But are you going to tell me that this clairvoyant saint didn't understand who Philaret was and what was needed by the Church in the coming decades? Of course he did. He picked the man for a reason. The Holy Spirit guided this choice, that this man who would be so staunchly anti-ecumenist and would be a beacon in the Orthodox world, that this was the man chosen. And so that's important to keep that in mind. Also, St. John may have had a premonition of his own repose, which is only 2 years later. Maybe he knew he wasn't going to live that long. He died at the age of 70, as did Vladika Verki in 1976. Okay. Let me go on reading. It was shortly thereafter that the ROCOR former first hierarch Metropolitan Anastasi reposed in the Lord in May of 1965. Now that Metropolitan Philaret was installed as first hierarch of the Russian Church abroad, the policy that was maintained by both Metropolitan Anthony and Anastasi would change, as Metropolitan Philaret wanted to help unite the old calendar churches as well as come to full communion with them. So Metropolitan Philaret had two goals. He wanted the Matthewites and Florinites to unite, and he wanted them to be in communion with the Russian Church abroad. So to give background, some of our listeners or students may not know this distinction. Maybe you don't know the background. We were divided into two groups basically. So Matthewites and so-called Florinites, because in 1937, St. Chrysostomos of Florina wrote in a private letter, he expressed the opinion that the New Calendar Church was in potential schism, not schism, and that we shouldn't say they have no grace. That it was too early to say that. So you see, he's kind of in the same spirit as Michel Anthony Krabovitsky. This is early on. Let's see what happens. That kind of thing. Let's not close the door. Let's not make any final statements. And one of the next group of bishops that had been consecrated by them, by the first group. The first group was Chrysostomos Yemanos of Dimitria and Chrysostomos of Zakynthos. And then there's the next group that was consecrated of Yemanos of the Kyklades, and this Matthew of Vrestina and others. And this Matthew said, well, you're a heretic, I'm breaking with you, because you wrote that in a letter. And so he had his own followers, and so the group was split. And then by 1948, Matthew was dying. Clearly he was dying. And his followers, especially a married priest, Father Eugene Tombros, pressured him to consecrate bishops by himself. It's the so-called one-handed consecration. And so he consecrated, I believe, Andreas and Spiridon. I forget the two or three that were consecrated. And so from that time on, they had this episcopal succession from the one hand, the single consecration, which of course is in violation of the First Apostolic Canon, that every bishop should be consecrated by at least two, but preferably three bishops. And then there was the main group, the larger group, so-called Florinites after St. Chrysostomos of Florina, although Florinis passed away in 55. There were no bishops in the main synod until 1960, you see. So the Matthewites always accused the other group of being too soft, and the other group always said, yeah, but you have this one-handed consecration, and this went on for decades. So St. Philaret saw this, and he wanted to, not only he wanted the Russian Church abroad and the Old Calendarists to be in union, but he wanted but as a condition of the union, he wanted the Greeks to be united. And we see that attitude continuing on the Russian Church abroad right into up until 1994, where they kept insisting that all the Greek calendars should be united before the Russian Church abroad should have a formal relationship with them. Okay, but let's go up to 1969 and read about the recognition of the consecrations. On November 25th, 1969, the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia officially changed its position on the consecrations of the Greek Calendrist bishops that took place in 1960 in Detroit, 1961 in Athens, and 1962 in Astoria by the few ROCOR hierarchs. So the whole Synod's now recognizing what those bishops did. And see, in 69, I don't know who is still alive. I know Seraphim Chicago is still alive because I was in the Russian Church abroad during his lifetime. Seraphim Caracas, and to Chile, I don't know what year they reposed. I don't remember if I ever knew. But Seraphim Chicago was definitely still alive in 1969. The ROCOR Synod, in a document addressed to Archbishop Auxentius and the Holy Synod of the Church of Orthodox Christians of Greece, states that Archbishop Auxentius is the successor to Akakios Papas. From 1960, they are consecrated Akakios Papas in Detroit. He was already elderly. He lived only a short time after that, and Archbishop Auxentius was chosen as Archbishop. And so he was the Archbishop from 64 until he was deposed in 1986, or 85 or 86 for certain canonical transgressions, which we'll get into later when we talk about the actual history of the Greek Orthodox true church in itself. Okay, we'll get into the chronology. So this is addressed to Archbishop Auxentius, to our Archbishop, in 1969. Quote, "The many trials which the Orthodox Church has endured from the beginning of its history are especially great in our evil times. Consequently, this especially requires unity among those who are truly devoted to the faith of the Fathers." So right away, it's saying, we recognize that you, like we, are devoted to the faith, unlike all these others. Right? With these sentiments, we wish to inform you that the Synod of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad recognizes the validity of the episcopal ordinations of your predecessor of blessed memory, the reposed Archbishop Akakios, and the consequent ordinations of your Holy Church. Hence, taking into account also various other circumstances, our Hierarchal Synod esteems your hierarchy as brothers in Christ in full communion with us. May the blessing of God rest upon all the clergy and faithful of your church, especially during the coming days of the nativity in the flesh of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So a statement of the recognition of the consecrations and the desire to be in full communion. 1969. Here it is. On the website, in Nectarius' article, there's a photograph. Here it is. I'm showing, for those listening, I'm showing this to the people sitting at the table. The photograph. It's a famous, every Greek calendrist has memorized this photograph, even though it's in Russian. It's in Russian. This good old-fashioned stationery. Notice in the old days they never put they never put crosses or icons on stationery because they knew that then you'd have to burn it, right? And so it's very modest. See, it's just typewritten. That's the way official documents used to look, right? They're just very modest. So it's dated 1831 December 1969, to his blessedness, his beatitude, the blessed Auxentius, Archbishop of the true Orthodox Christians in Greece, your beatitude, and so forth. Vatskoya Poslania, Bashava, etc. So, and signed at the very bottom, the youngest bishop who signed it was also the secretary, the assistant secretary, Loris. There's Laver. He was functioning as a secretary. So his signature was on there. By the way, today was his name. Tomorrow's his name's day. So God have mercy on his soul. There are all the signatures: Seraphim, Vitale, Antoni, Avierki, Antoni, Salva, Nictari, Andrei of Rockland, another saint. Father Adrian Rimarenko, who after the prose of his Matryoshka became Bishop Adrian. Bishop Andrei, another clairvoyant elder, spiritual writer, remarkable personality of the Russian Church abroad. These are giants. These are great men. You know, we're in the footsteps. We're little ants walking in the footsteps of giants. All right, from 1969 forward, therefore, the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, under the saintly leadership of Metropolitan Philaret of New York, recognized the ordinations of the genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece that had been performed by those few ROCOR hierarchs several years before. ROCOR now was in communion with both the Philaretite and Matthewite branches of the old Greek calendar church. So the ROCOR had independently also contacted the Matthewites and said, "We want to be in communion with you too." But they wanted to regularize the Matthewite consecrations through hierothesia. To make clear, to a definition here, hierothesia, we have two words. We have hierotonia, or hierotoni, which means the laying on of hands, which is the formal term. Hierotonia is a term for ordination, full sacramental ordination. Then we have another word, hierothesia, which also means laying on of hands, which is a regularization of a previous consecration. So in a hierothesia, the candidate is already fully vested in his office. And a prayer of one of the prayers, usually just one of the prayers, the ordination is read over him, just to, you might say, seal or consecrate or bless because the previous consecration that he'd gone through, the form was fully complete. The assumption is that the form was completely intact. Just as with baptism, right? We accept people by chrismation if we can accept, we don't have to, but we can accept them by chrismation if the form of their baptism was fully correct. They're baptized by 3 immersions in the name of the Holy Trinity, right? So assuming that the form of the ordination was correct and that this group is a group that had historical apostolic consecration, but for some reason was in schism or had irregular existence, but were Orthodox in faith, then we can perform a hierothesia, which is just a regularization of the consecration. Okay. So this is what the Russian Church abroad wanted to do for the Matthewites. By 1971, Metropolitan Philaret and the Holy Synod of the ROCOR wanted these two groups to unite and become one Old Calendar Greek Orthodox Church. That makes sense, right? This desire, however honorable, would eventually break down the already shaky unity that existed because of differences in ecclesiology of the Russian Church abroad, the Florinite Synod, and the Matthewite Synod. We'll get to that later, these ecclesiological questions. Right? In addition to the differences of opinion concerning ecclesiology as it revolved around the matters of grace and the mysteries in the New Calendar modernist jurisdictions. So there's the grace question. And I'll tell you right now, the true Orthodox always cause schisms with each other, or argue with each other about two things. Is there grace in the New Calendar Church, and do you commune New Calendarists? So whenever they want to make a schism, they'll say, aha, you believe there's grace in the New Calendarists, or you don't believe there's grace in the New Calendarists, and you're communing the New Calendarists, or you're not communing the New Calendarists. See? And then they'll create this huge fight about this, instead of saying, this is really complicated, and we're all confessing the faith here. Let's just work together. And we don't want to be with them. We're not with them, right? And there are very firm reasons to believe there is no grace. But why would you want to find out the hard way? If there's grace or not. So to give advance warning, what the unity, the ship of unity of the true Orthodox always would come to grief on the rocks of this accursed question of the presence of grace in the ecumenist jurisdictions, and the disciplinary question of, well, we heard that your priest somewhere communes the New Calendarists, or communes the World Orthodox, or we heard your priest in Poughkeepsie received a New Calendarist by confession instead of chrismation or baptism, and then creating a scandal over it, which is it's placing a burden of uniformity and a burden of corporate discernment and uniformity on people in a very beleaguered situation. Which is why I always direct people away from fighting about those questions. Not directed away from thinking about them, very important, but away from making them a cause of a break in church unity. Okay. So we'll talk about that later. Okay. In addition to the differences of opinion about matters of grace and the mysteries of the New Calendar, there's the matter of the problematic episcopal consecration. So the Matthewite hierarchy of Bishop Matthew, when violation of Canon 1 of the Apostolic Canons, single-handedly consecrated for himself a synod, despite Canon 1 explicitly stating that a bishop be ordained by 2 or 3 bishops. So it was clearly an irregular consecration. But in defense of the Matthewites, there is precedent in church history for single consecrations. For example, in the Church of England, I believe it was Saint Theodore of Tarsus, or maybe it was earlier, maybe St. Augustine of Canterbury wrote back to Rome and said, I don't have another bishop. I've got to make bishops. I don't have another bishop. And the Pope said, well, you just have to. You have no choice. You see. So just make more bishops. And this is either in the 7th or 8th centuries. I don't remember if it was St. Augustine or St. Theodore, but it was early on in the English church. So so of course Matthew's followers were claiming that there was a necessity. I mean, Matthew's followers did not claim, it doesn't matter. They said, we know that we're supposed to have 2 or 3 bishops, but we were stuck. You guys, you Florinites, were too soft on this grace issue about the New Calendarists, so we were all alone, and we had to do this because we had nobody with us. Okay. So what's interesting, here's at this point in the article on the website, he has a photograph of Father Seraphim Rose, letter number 253, 1978. I saw these letters were collected and published by Father Alexei Young, and I saw them in manuscript form when back in Denver in 88. Father Alexei came up to me and said, I want you to read this. And he handed me this sheaf of typewritten, where he'd taken Father Seraphim's handwriting and typed up all his letters. It was fascinating to see the workings of the mind of this man, Father Seraphim Rose. So what you see from the writings of Father Seraphim Rose about ecclesiology is that it's extremely nuanced. And so neither fire-breathing so-called far-right Old Calendarists can claim him as their own, nor can the apologists for the Moscow Patriarchate Union. They can't claim him as his own either. His thinking is very nuanced, and he died in 1982. But he was very against ecumenism. And he had no desire to serve with the Greek Archdiocese or OCA or anybody like that, right? And look at this letter. This is a quote from a letter he wrote in 78, 4 years before he died. We are in full communion with the Greek Old Calendar's jurisdiction, our Church of Exendius in Athens, and with the Catacomb Coach, and with the Catacomb Church in Russia. With other jurisdictions, our relations are strained and in some cases broken altogether. That was exactly the case. He's saying and that's exactly the case in 85 when I joined the Russian Church Abroad, 7 years later. He's describing exactly the position we were in. We were in communion with the Old Calendarists, the Catacomb Church, and our relationship with everybody else was either broken altogether, broken, of course, with Moscow and the Evlogians and OCA, but also strained with everybody else. And we were alone, right? We were the last guy left standing in the room. So he's describing Father Seraphim this isn't a polemical tract. He's just, in a letter, he's just stating the situation. Okay, so there's all the revisionists who say that this wasn't the case. They have to rewrite these things, or deep six these documents to justify what they say. Okay. All right, let's go on with our story now. These single-handed consecrations of the Matthewites were corrected by the Russian Church Abroad on the Matthewite bishops Callistos of Corinth and Epiphanius of Cyprus at Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Boston, Massachusetts in September of 1971. Okay. According to an official synodal letter penned by Archbishop Gregory Grabe, or Archpriest Gregory, he wasn't Archpriest Gregory, he was Archpriest George. He's mixing up his names. He was Father George Grabe until his Matushka passed away, and then he became Bishop Gregory later on. But he is Bishop Gregory, before that Father George Grabe, before that Count George Grabe, had been the Chancellor of the Russian Church Abroad since before the repose of Anthony Krabovitsky. He was continuously the Chancellor of the Church Abroad from 1935 to the end of 1985. First as a layman, then as a married priest, and then as a bishop. So anyway, this is an official letter written by Father George Grabe in November of 73. The bishops Callistos and Epiphanius were not ordained by our synod. They were accepted in communion as bishops with only the laying on of hands on them already in bishop's vestments, according to the 8th canon of the First Ecumenical Council, which is how to receive people in this situation. That it was to rectify beyond doubts the irregularity caused by the founding of their hierarchy through the consecration originally performed by one bishop. So it's mainly to rectify beyond doubt, or it's to make it sure and to settle the consciences of the faithful, not as a statement that prior to that these men were not bishops, not doubting the grace of their consecration, but to regularize the consecrations. That's what a hierothesia is. And this is what happened, the union of our church in 2014, when the former Hackna bishops, 2012 and 2014. 2010 and 2012. I'm losing track of time now. When the Hackna, the Bostonites, when they started to fall apart because of their heresies, and two bishops, Bishop Moses and Bishop Sergius, were the first wave. Right. Then the next wave was our present Metropolitan Demetrius, right, and they were received by hierothesia, right, because we knew that our bishops knew that the bishops who had consecrated them did have apostolic succession through Archbishop Exendius, but Exendius had been deposed. You see, so you can't be consecrated by a deposed hierarchy. But we didn't insist, our bishops did not insist on full consecration, but these bishops, now Metropolitan Moses and Bishop Sergius, then Bishop Demetrius, were clothed in episcopal garments and recognized as bishops, but then they received the hierothesia from our synod to regularize and to make, so that as it says here, to rectify beyond doubt the reality of their consecrations. Now, getting back to the Matthewites, this was done with the foregoing agreement that these two bishops would return to Greece and perform this laying on of hands on all the other bishops, and the bishops would do their clergy as well. And this is quite possible. This is not like the situation in the Byzantine Empire in the 9th century, when it was physically probably impossible to reordain all of the iconoclast clergy. That's why St. Photius was installed. That's why they deposed St. Ignatius and enthroned St. Photius, because he was of the moderate party who would simply receive the iconoclast hierarchy and priests simply by confession of faith, by their rejoining the church. See, where St. Ignatius was of the strict party that insists on reordaining everybody, and that would have probably psychologically and also just logistically created a huge barrier to getting all these vast numbers of iconoclast clergy back into the church. But the Matthewites, such a small group, it was logistically it was completely possible. They could have these Callistus and Epiphanius could have performed hierothesia, and then the bishops could have done hierothesia for their priests, and they'd all be regularized. But what happened? Oh no. Once they returned to Greece, this was immediately rejected by the majority of the Matthewites, which ultimately led to their synod breaking communion with the Russian church abroad. They were so stiff-necked. No, we are the right ones. Who are they? How dare they say they have to regularize us? We should be regularizing them. And some of them even said, and I know this is crazy, but some of them even said that when our bishops, the Church Abroad bishops, that is Constantine of Britain and Philaret of Hamburg, I think, were the consecrating bishops. When they laid hands on the Matthewite bishops gave grace to them, just as the head of Christ consecrated the hand of the forerunner. So it's really wild. I mean, people go to such extremes to justify their correctness, right? That they're right. So all they do is be humble and say, whether we need it or not, thank God they did this, and let's all be together. They wouldn't do it, right? No, we're the right ones, right? It's that attitude. This is when the World Orthodox criticize the old calendars. It's these kinds of attitudes, this kind of thinking, that it makes us an easy target, right? We make up these fantastic sort of arguments for being isolated or for not seeking union, for regarding this group is superior to that group, and so forth. So we don't want to have those kinds of attitudes. So the Matthewites did not carry out their end of the bargain. Now, in 1974, the Florenite Synod, in an attempt to show equal fidelity to the official confession of 1950, and show the Matthewites they were just as strict as their confession, published an encyclical entitled "Thus Do We Believe, Thus Do We Speak," which denied that the official state Church of Greece was with grace. It denied that they had grace. He made a little mental error there. Which denied the state church had grace in their mysteries, or stated they were without grace. However, Bishop Petros of our church in America refused to sign the document under the advice of St. Philaret of New York. St. Philaret at that time thought it was not wise. It wasn't the time to say they're without grace. And the Holy Synod of our church abroad, who had consecrated him to the episcopacy. This refusal to sign the document caused the Synod of the genuine Orthodox Church of Greece to remove Petros from the Synod. And also Petros was removed as the exarch, or the representative of the Synod in this country. Okay? Now to show you how complicated things can get. So what's going on here? In 1950, Chrysostomos of Florina, to reassure the hoping that the Matthewites would come back, said, all right, I'll say the new calendars have no grace. Now, Matthewites come back. Oh, no, we're not going to come back. You have to come back to us. This kind of thing. Then in 1974, the Florenite Synod under Auxentius issued the same statement. The sacraments of the new calendarists are without grace. Okay? Now, the Russian Church abroad wasn't ready to go there. They were certainly ready not to be in communion with them. They were certainly ready. They'd already recognized the old calendarists, but they weren't ready to make this statement. Okay? And Petros wasn't ready either to make this statement. Those knew under Petros knew that he never wanted to just come out and say that, right? And to show how complicated things get, so at that time in 1974, Petros will not sign that statement. So the Synod in Greece removes him as exarch. You're no longer our representative here, and all of our parishes in North America should stop commemorating you. And we're going to send we're going to send someone who signed the statement. And that person was Paisios, who turned out to be the biggest crook who ever lived, and later on renounced the old calendarists and received reconsecration from Bartholomew of Constantinople for $1 million. Okay. And Petros, to the end, was a confessing true bishop. You see. So you don't always make it to the end by being super strict or super fanatical about things, right? And people can be, in our experience of the old calendar church, often crooks and no goods, and people who either were agents like Paisios, whom we pretty well know was a CIA agent, he was a bad egg, and his sidekick Vikindios. People like their agents are people just who are unsavory. People who have been kicked out by the new calendar bishops for a good reason, because they were fornicators or they were embezzlers. Come to our bishops and say, "Oh, I confess the faith. New calendars have no grace. Bartholomew is the Antichrist." And our bishops go, "Oh, a brother, we'll take you in," and then make him a priest. And then that person causes so many problems in our church. Now, this isn't happening now. Since the time of the blessed Archbishop Chrysostomos Cusis, who really did a lot of housekeeping in our church from 86 onwards, these kind of things stopped happening. Right? But to understand why many people who are actually in the know have gotten bad feelings over the years about things that have gone on in our church, we have to understand that our bishops were often naive and would take in people and appoint people to high positions just because they pretended to be super strict, super Orthodox, like this Paisios. And here in Detroit, and this affects people in the trenches, it affects people on the ground. I have parishioners and former parishioners who were affected by this at St. Spiridon's in Detroit. They had the Paisios faction and the Petros faction. And the parish split, and there were people who didn't talk to each other for years because of this kind of thing. Okay, so what that tells us is that we have to be yes, we're confessing the faith. Yes, we can't be with the world Orthodox because of their ecumenism. But in our part, we have to be very humble. And we have to be very cautious about how we approach people and about also what our place is. I'm just a parish priest. You're just layman. You're not responsible for directing the whole church, right? Unless there's an egregious apostasy or break in faith, which is what happened with the world Orthodox. See? Anyway, that's a little footnote from Father Stephen, because I'm trying to train all our young true Orthodox to be wise, right? To be cautious about the statements we make, and to always be understanding our history. I was talking to the older people who had experience in our church, so that we don't repeat some of the same mistakes that were made in the past. Of course, there is the question: is there grace in the new calendar? Is there grace in the Moscow Patriarchate? That is a real question. St. Philaret in 74 didn't believe it was the time to make this dramatic statement. Okay? And later on, I think as part of our study, we should read the very important monograph by Dr. Andreev, Is the Grace of God Present in the Soviet Church, 1948. And he goes through all these, he goes through this question, and he goes through the process of discerning this question, how he felt that we should do the question back in 48. But that's, of course, things have changed a lot since 48. But it's a very good foundational study and meditation to try to understand some basic assumptions and methods we should use to address, and the spirit, above all, the spirit within which we should address this question. And which is ultimately, our answers always have to be for the salvation of the faithful. Not simply to have a scientifically correct response, but for the salvation of the faithful. Okay. So anyway, so Petros refused to sign the document. The Synod in Greece removed Petros from the Synod. They also removed Petros as the exarch in America, and they sent us the biggest crook of all time, Paisios, to be our exarch in America, because he did sign the document. In a letter by Petros of Astoria to the Russian Synod, he wrote, "I was ordained by the most holy bishops of the Russian Church outside of Russia. My ordination was recognized by the Russian Synod. From a canonical aspect, I should have belonged to the Russian Synod from the time of my ordination, but my heart was set in healing the struggling anti-ecumenist, anti-modernist Old Calendar Church of Greece, which is truly suffering greatly from the enemies of the faith. However, I always enjoyed and desired to have communion with my maternal Russian Synod. My communion with the Synod of Greece has been severed, And the Russian Holy Synod of Bishops has also suffered communion with me, ironically enough, because I obey and follow its own decree. So this is the irony. This is the great tragedy of Petros and how he was really a hero. So Petros, the Dick of Philaret says, don't sign that. Don't sign that document. It's too radical. So he doesn't sign it. The bishops in Greece de-recognize him. And then the Russian bishops say, well, we can't welcome you to our synod because we want to maintain a relationship with the Greek Calendar Synod. So the poor man was a martyr. I mean, he's a martyr of integrity, right? So he was people attack Metropolitan Petros for all kinds of reasons, but I encourage everyone to watch the two films that Bishop Christodolos made of the biography of Petros, and see this is a real man struggling with a really difficult situation, and he's really a martyr of conscience. He's really a great man. Okay. So Petrus's letter goes on. As for my future canonical position, I think I should be in accordance with the holy canons of the Church, in the words of St. Ignatius Godbearer, where there is unity, there is also Jesus Christ. Where there is unity, there is Jesus Christ. It is therefore my conviction that the only canonical thing for me and my clergymen to do is to ask my brother bishops to accept me into the council of the bishops of the Russian Church abroad as a full member of the Synod's jurisdiction. Presently, we commemorate Philaret's name during the proskomedia, but we dearly want to commemorate his name during all the services, and it's out loud, right, in all the churches. I consider the Russian Synod an oasis of orthodoxy in a desert of ecumenism and heresy, which we all do. Right? It is for this reason that it is my fondest wish to have ecclesiastical union with you. Tragically, the Russian synods refusal left Bishop Petros without membership in any synod. Later on, Petros was reunited to our synod by Archbishop Chrysostomos Kousis after he became the Archbishop in 1986. But this is back in the 70s at this point. In that same year, the Russian Orthodox Church in a synodal letter clarified its position on the new calendar. Those modernist jurisdictions using the innovation, saying, so this is 1974. In 1974, there was an all immigration subwar, all diaspora subwar in Jordanville. And there was a strict party, Metropolitan St. Philaret and Bishop Gregory and others, wanted to formally break communion with the groups in the World Council of Churches. But Anthony of Geneva and his party threatened to go into schism if they did that. So Metropolitan Philaret backed off. So, well, we're practically not in communion with them anyway, so we're not going to push formal severance of communion. So that's the background to what I'm about to read to you. Okay. The outcome of that all diaspora subwar, okay, which is basically kicking the can down the road, or kicking the ball down the road. Here's the statement. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia considers the introduction of the new calendar as a mistake, bringing irregularity into the life of the Church, and the final end causing a schism. Therefore, she did not accept it, does not accept it, and will not accept it, and avoids concelebration with the new calendarists. Didn't say forbid, avoids, that was the situation, avoiding it. It was rare. It was very rare by this time. Okay. As to the question regarding the presence or non-existence of grace on the new calendars, the Russian Church outside of Russia does not regard itself or any local church as having the authority to reach a final decision, since a definitive ruling in this matter can only be made by a properly convoked competent ecumenical council. So here's the idea: it has to be an ecumenical council, but not to break communion. Just this absence or presence of grace. But even that is a real question. This is a confusing statement. With the indispensable participation of a free Church of Russia, which never happened. Let's see. 1225 September 1974. See? So they bring up this whole thing of has to be an ecumenical council. Okay? But that was because of the insistence of the Liberal Party in the Russian Church abroad. See, so they introduced this idea. But if you say only an ecumenical council can decide this, then you're setting an impossibly high bar to make this decision. No ecumenical council ever said the Roman Catholics were without grace. No ecumenical council ever said the Lutherans were without grace. So they still have grace. You see, so it's simply a mistake. Because you're trapping people in a situation where they can't they can't really rule the church. They can't define the boundaries of the church. See? But this is the result of the fact that within the Russian Church abroad, there was a liberal party that just could not conceive of itself being institutionally separated from world orthodoxy, from these venerable institutions of the old patriarchates. Let's go on. As the years passed by and the chaos in the old calendar churches began to die down, Bishop Petrus was eventually received back in the Synod of the General Orthodox Churches of Greece in 85. Well, the chaos didn't just die down. The chaos was stopped by Archbishop Chrysostomos Kousis, who was elected in 85 after the deposition of Auxentius. And it's due to his heritage, to his labors from 85 until his repose in, I think, 2010, that our church became united. Because he got rid of the bad eggs. But he made it too hot. He made things too hot for them to handle, and they got out. The bad eggs left on their own and created schisms on their own, and eventually revealed for what they were. And so it's Archbishop Chrysostomos Kousis he's way up there. He's when the history of the church is written, he will be a great figure. He'll be a great figure. So he always was friends with Metropolitan Petros. They never stopped being good friends. And I remember friends of ours who were in Thessalonica saw them celebrating back in 85 in Thessalonica. When Archbishop Kousis wasn't even elected yet, Archbishop was still sort of an independent bishop in Thessalonica, and he was already celebrating with Petros before his election to Archbishop. So he was always close to Petros, and he saw, Archbishop Chrysostomos Kousis saw past the legalities and the formalism to the real man. That's part of his genius. To see the real man, not just the PR, not just the positions on paper, but who is this person really? And so you could trust him to know who our friends are. So Archbishop Chrysostomos Kousis brought Petros back into the Synod in 85. In 94, now Metropolitan Petros was also received at the Russian Church abroad as a member of the Synod, albeit a non-voting member. In response to a letter written by Metropolitan Petros, Bishop Hilarion Capral of Manhattan wrote the following reply in March 12, 1995. So Bishop Hilarion, who later became Metropolitan after the ROCOR, the MP Union, he was Bishop of Manhattan, Manhattan was always the title of an assistant bishop who served at the Synod headquarters and served like a mouthpiece or a PR man, so to speak, for the Synod. Or just handle correspondence. I mean, he's the one, Bishop Hilarion is one to respond to me in 85 when I asked to join the Russian Church. He wrote back to me. Okay. So in 95, Vladika Ladion writes, "This is to inform you that the session of the Synod of Bishops of our church held on Thursday, February 10, 23 of that year, of the Feast of St. Charalambos. Your request for a vicar bishop and candidacy of Archimandrite Paul was taken into careful consideration. The members of the Synod have given a positive response to your request for an assistant bishop. They wish to take more time to become better acquainted with Father Paul before making a decision. In any case, please be assured that you will be given a vicar, that the Synod of Bishops values your presence within its episcopate, and that it will not abandon you and your diocese in a time of need." Okay. What happened was, Vladika Ilarion told me this personally, and all these men are... this man's passed away now, so I think I can say what he said to me in private. He was Father Paul's spiritual father, and he did not recommend him. They were good friends, and he didn't recommend Father Paul for the episcopacy, and that's why. So Father Paul wasn't turned down because they didn't recognize Petros or didn't recognize our church. It was a spiritual decision by the spiritual father Vladika Ladion, who was Father Paul's spiritual father at that time. But later on, Archbishop Chrysostomos Kousis did approve the candidacy, and Father Paul was consecrated bishop and became Metropolitan Pavlos, who was our ruling hierarch from the time of his consecration in 98, I think it was 98, until then he had a really bad stroke until 2005. Then the Synod made him keep governing the church until I think 2012, when Metropolitan Demetrius was appointed. Okay, I could be wrong in my years there, but that's the basic chronology. Okay, so that's all the background behind this. But I'm relaying this, again, this is a personal conversation. Blake Ladion told me this, so I don't, he was very honest. I mean, I wouldn't have told me this if it wasn't true. So that's, so it was Father Paul, as it turns out, the Russians did not consecrate Father Paul, Statigas, but it was not because of a non-recognition of Bishop Petros or our church. It was strictly a personal non-recommendation by the spiritual father, who was, at that time, Bishop Philaret. All right, let's go on. The Russian Orthodox Church abroad and her true sister churches. Over the course of time, the hierarchs of the Russian Church Synod became weary of the constant turbulence the old counter situation created, and while communion with the old countess was still there, it was on shaky ground. Well, in effect, really, and what we were instructed to do in the 80s and the early 90s was that our lay people communed back and forth, but we didn't serve with the Greek old calendarists. When I say we, because I was in the Russian Church abroad at the time. I'm sorry. I'm sure it's confusing. I keep saying we, and I'm meaning different people by we. Depending on what my own chronology was. But I say we because I'm talking about when I was in the Russian Church abroad in the 80s and the early 90s. That's the we I'm talking about at this moment. We were told.
Can I turn the light on?
Yes, turn the light on. No, we don't serve with any of the Greek counter clergy because that means you're taking sides with one synod against it because they were so split. Because it wasn't just Matthewites and Floronites anymore, and now the Floronites had split into different groups, and later the Matthewites split into different groups. So it became really absurd. And so the Russians just backed off, and they said, we're not communing with any of you, or out of communion with any of you, but we're not going to celebrate with you until you get your situation straightened out. Then when you get your situation straightened out, come back and we'll all serve together. But the lay people, the Russian Church abroad lay people, were never told not to commune with in the Greek Orthodox Church, and the Greek Calendars freely communed in the Russian Church abroad. The Greek Calendar lay people freely communed in the Church abroad. And frankly, even during this period, when Bishop Petros went to Jordanville, they welcomed him as a bishop. He even served at Jordanville during this time. We have films of him serving at Jordanville during this period. It was a fluid situation. But generally, the Russian Church abroad didn't want to recognize one group, which would mean de-recognizing the other groups. Okay. In 1993, the Synod of Bishops, under the leadership of Metropolitan Vitali, published a resolution that resolved to consider the previous decision of the Council of Bishops of the Russian Church abroad, Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, dated September 6, 1975, concerning the refraining. And so in 75, remember the Matthewites is in 71. The statement that Petros would not sign was in 74. So now the Russians are going, oh, this is really messed up. So in 75, they say, in 75, the Russian Church abroad said, we will refrain from celebration with the hierarchy and clergy until unity is achieved among the various Greek jurisdictions. That's the official position of the Russian Church abroad from 75 to 94. We will not serve with them. They didn't say they're not Orthodox. They didn't say we take back the recognition of the consecrations. They didn't say our people can't go to communion there. They just said we don't want to celebrate until they get their situation straightened out. This was done because of the constant infighting that again began to occur within these old calendar jurisdictions in Greece. However, the ceasing of concelebrations was short-lived. Well, short-lived only, now here's the part I have to do a lot of explanation. On 28 June, 11 July 1994, the Council of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia addressed the question of the possibility of entering into communion in prayer and Eucharistic with the group of Old Calendar Greeks headed by Metropolitan Cyprian. A committee which consists of Archbishop Lauris and Bishops Daniel and Mitrophon was established to examine this. After deliberation and analysis of all aspects, the Council of Bishops holds that at the present time, when apostasy is spreading and many official representatives of Orthodoxy, such as the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarchates are succumbing to and embracing the position of the modernist and ecumenists, it is very important for the true Orthodox Church to unite, stand together, and oppose the betrayers of the orthodoxy of the Holy Fathers. In connection with this, the Council of Bishops has decided, 1, to establish communion and prayer and the Eucharist with the old Greek Calendar Synod of Metropolitan Cyprian. So here's a new name all of a sudden. Right? Wait a second, where did he come from? We thought Auxentius was the archbishop. Who's this guy? And I'll address that. As well as His Grace Bishop Photius of Triadica, who heads the Bulgarian Old-Counter Diocese, a tiny little church in Bulgaria. Okay. 2, all parties refrain from interfering in each other's internal ecclesiastical affairs. If any questions arise which require deliberation, it is essential to take counsel together. Resolved to communicate the above side decision with on Cyprian Bishop Photius. 2, to inform our clergy and flock of the council's decision through publication of church periodicals. So from 75 to 94, the Russians said, you guys get straightened out, unite, then we'll can celebrate. In 94, suddenly it changed. They chose one isolated faction, with a highly idiosyncratic and now debunked ecclesiology to enter into communion with. Why? Why that group? And our author doesn't state is that along with this statement that we're now in communion with the Cyprianites was a statement that their ecclesiology is identical to ours. That was the important point. Okay. That was the important point. Now, what was the ecclesiology of Cyprian? The ecclesiology of Cyprian was highly idiosyncratic, extremely complicated, so that they always had plausible deniability about what they really meant by anything they said. But the question is, why did the Church of Broad decide to do this in 94? Why then? After all those years of saying, you guys unite, then suddenly we're saying, oh no, don't unite, we'll just unite with this little faction over here, the Cyprianites. Now, our author doesn't address this at all in this article. He's just kind of talking right past it, right? Just breezing over it. Okay, but that's an important question. Why the Cyprianites? They're not the Synod that we were dealing with. The Synod was under Bishop Auxentius, and in 94 it's under Chrysostomos Chiusis. That's the real Synod, not this little faction. So why them? And the answer, I can't prove this because I didn't have wiretaps in the conversations. But it seems rather odd that the two bishops who were pushing, now they appointed Mitrophant and Daniel to help investigate this stuff, but the two bishops who kept pushing and pushing up to this point for the union of the Cyprianites were Mark of Berlin and Laurus. Mark of Berlin and Laurus, up to this time, had no interest in the Greeks at all. No interest in old calendarists. Didn't care about old calendarists. Suddenly, they claim they want all this unity with the old calendarists. Why? Because Mark and Laurus were the agents to push the union of the Moscow Patriarchate. Okay. And so, what did the Cyprianites have that Laurus and Mark wanted? They had an ecclesiology that could be tailored to brainwash the clergy and faithful of the Russian Church abroad into going to communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. The purpose of the union with the Cyprianites was to bring about the union with the Moscow Patriarchate. How? Why is that so? It is so because the pillars, the main tenet of the Cyprianite ecclesiology is not only that we hesitate to say there's no grace in the new calendarists. Oh no. The Cyprianite ecclesiology is we know there's grace in the new calendarists. We have cataphatic, positive, scientific knowledge. There is grace in the new calendarists, and to deny this is blasphemous. And if you deny this, you're one of those fanatic, crazy old calendar zealots that we want to have nothing to do with. See? So the hardcore position of the hardcore old calendarists was, we know the ecumenists have no grace. The position of the Russian Church abroad was all over the place. From those who are very hardcore, we know they have no grace, to those who want to celebrate with them tomorrow. But in the Russian Church abroad, there was a modus vivendi. Okay, we'll agree to disagree about this, but we just won't celebrate with them. Okay, but the Cyprianite idea introduces a new factor. Not only do we hesitate to make this pronouncement, we don't hesitate at all. We know there's grace in the new calendars. We know that. But we're separate. We're walled off because we're spiritually superior. We're the healthy ones in the church, and they're the sick ones in the church. So if you read the Cyprianite ecclesiological documents, right up to 94, up to this point, the pillars of their ecclesiology are that they are still members of the state church of Greece, but they're walled off from the innovating hierarchy, whom they claim are still the canonical hierarchy and still have grace. But we're the spiritual elite. We're walled off because we're defending orthodoxy. We're the resistors. They call themselves the resistors. We're the resistor. We're resisting. See? So it's very, very close to that fighting from within concept, right? But about all the other old calendarists, they'll say, well, those other old calendarists, they have zeal without knowledge. You must not join them. That's just as bad as being in the new calendar. We're the moderate ones. So they had this mantra of moderation, 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 moderation. Right? That truth is a mean between extremes. Of course, no philosopher or theologian ever said such a thing. Right? Virtue is a mean between extremes, but not truth. Truth is truth. It's not a mean between extremes. Right? So orthodoxy is a mean between extremes. No, it's not. It's just orthodoxy. Okay. So it was a boondoggle. The entire Cyprianite project is a boondoggle. And Loris and Mark brought them, and they the analogy I use is that, or the image I use is that they needed the Cyprianite ecclesiology. That's the product they needed. Now they held their noses and took the Cyprianite union as the package. They bought the pack. They had to buy the package to get the product. Okay. But once they got that product, and they said, look, we've signed a document. We've now, as of 94, we've signed a document saying we know there's grace in the Moscow Patriarchate. We know there is. So then it started working in the minds of the clergy and the faithful. Well, if we know there's grace, how can we not be in communion with them? Right? Because the ordinary mind isn't capable of the sophistical gymnastics of the Cyprianite PhDs, right? They just see things, ordinary people see things straight on. Well, if we know they have grace, they must be the church. Because only the church has grace, right? So this laid the Cyprianite Union was a very important step in the long-term KGB op to bring about the capitulation to the Moscow Patriarchate. And this is my biggest modification or objection to Mr. Nectarius's, Subdeacon Nectarius's article. He just passes over this. Here's Cyprian and we're in communion with him, and I guess that's restored communion with the old calendarists. Well, no, it hasn't. What it did was de-recognize or push to the side the real old calendarists, who are the Synod and Church of Chrysostomos, GOCs. See, that's what really happened here. So he goes on. He talks about the good relationships and concelebrations of the church abroad and these Cyprianites, and he talks about a beautiful day, which is the glorification of Saint Glyceri of Romania, because also even prior to the Cyprianite union, the church abroad had already entered into a communion with the Romanian Old Calendar Church, right? Much more with much more integrity, more savory, more true confessors than the Cyprianites. But the Romanian Old Calendar Church somehow had maintained a long relationship with the Cyprianites. See, I talked to Metropolitan Vlasi. That was the Romanian Metropolitan. I talked to him back in 98. I was in Romania in 98. And I said, do you stay in contact with Metropolitan Cyprian? He said, oh yes, we talk on the phone every day. So I suppose they spoke French on the phone. I don't know if Cyprians spoke Romanian or Vlasi spoke Greek. So they were very close. And so, but curiously, the Romanians have an ecclesiology just as strict and clear as the Matthewites. They've always thought that. The Romanians have never thought for 1 second that the New Calendar Church had grace. So why they had cut this close relationship with the Cyprianites all those years, and now they claim they didn't know what they thought. Which to me is I talked to Bishop Flavian's assistant, Father Gelassi, last year, and he said, oh, what about, he said, we're upset about all this Cyprianism. And I said, well, you guys were in communion with them for 30 years. I say, you really didn't know what they taught? I mean, come on. But anyway, they're very simple people. They're very pious. So anyway, so it goes on. This section's about the recognition or the canonization of Saint Glyceri of Romania. That's a wonderful story, by the way. Etna does sell the life of Saint Glyceri. It's a beautiful story. It goes on and talks about Saint Glyceri and article or Orthodox Life that talks about Saint Glyceri and so forth. So from our author's point of view, this is all a beautiful period. It's all beautiful. The Russian Church of Abroad is in communion with Greeks, with Romanians, Bulgarians. It's wonderful. It's a beautiful period. And actually, in some ways, it was, of course. It's always nice to be in communion with other people who are fighting ecumenism, and they're pious, and they seem really good people, right? The problem was that whether they were, I'm not accusing the Cyprianites, even Chrysostomos of Etna, who was, had all kinds of connections to the American security apparatus and the State Department, but I can't prove anything against him, so I'll let sleeping dogs lie. De mortuis nihil nisi bonum. But even if the Cyprianites and the Etnites in particular were not agents, they were being used by the Laurus and Mark faction because their quirky, weird ecclesiology that posited a positive knowledge of grace in the New Calendarists was an important step in the brainwashing campaign going on in the 90s, for which I had a front row seat. I'm not talking to someone who just read about this. I was there at these clergy conferences and articles and internet wars and all that went into the brainwashing. And the whole Cyprianite idea of the positive knowledge of grace in the mother, they called the Moscow Patriarchate the mother church. One time I wrote a statement against the Moscow Patriarchate, and one of the Cyprianite clergy wrote me and chastised me for attacking my mother church. I said the KGB Metropolit Bureau in Moscow was my mother church, right? This is how mistaken they were. Now he goes on. He's going to go on now to the unfortunate capitulation to the Moscow Patriarchate. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia had been in dialogue with the Moscow Patriarchate concerning reunification of the two Russian jurisdictions after 80 years of separation. This dialogue and eventual but sudden reunification, again, he calls it a reunification. It's not a reunification. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia never needed to be reunited to the Russian Orthodox Church. They were the Russian Orthodox Church. Okay, the Moscow Patriarchate was an uncanonical, fake criminal organization set up by Joseph Stalin. The eventual unification was not well received by all within the Russian Church abroad. No kidding. The concerns of the Moscow Patriarchate was still a member of the World Council of Churches, which it still is in 2023, 16 years later. Still actively participating in the heretical ecumenical movement, which ROCOR had anathematized. So this man's in ROCOR MP, and he's stating, at that time in 2006, 2007, a lot of people objected because Moscow was still in the WCC. They were still ecumenists, which had been formally anathematized by our church in 83. So by joining Moscow in 2007, we fell into our own anathema. That's what they were saying. I thought, you guys aren't worried about that? Like, you're not disturbed by that? See? And the question of surgeonism, never officially repented of, weighed on the minds of many. Of course, it's not only not officially repented of, it's now completely justified. Surgeonism is now part and parcel of the Moscow Patriarchate's position, that it's equivalent to, that the witness of the confessing non-surgeonists and surgeonism are equivalent ecclesiologies. They're equivalent approaches to the relationship of the church to the government. They are morally and theologically equivalent. That's the neo-surgeonism of the Moscow Patriarchate. Right? To incorporate everyone in a new Hegelian synthesis, so to speak. This became a problem among the old calendar sister churches, which were in full Eucharistic communion. Yes, of course. Now, at this point, the Cyprianites have to say, well, we can't be in communion with you because we've been denouncing ecumenism all these years. Now you're ecumenists. This union of this Russian Synod with a jurisdiction that represented everything they were resisting. So he's saying, this author is saying the Moscow Patriarchate represents everything that we were against, right? Was a pill that could not be swallowed. As 2007 drew near, many letters were exchanged between all the sins involved. Father Alexander Lebedev was sent to Romania and Bulgaria for official visits. Alexander read the letter addressed to His Eminence by the Synod bishops, Russian Orthodox Church abroad, blah, blah, blah. You can read this on the website. Father Alexander Lebedev was basically an apparatchik of the unionist hierarchy. Father Alexander Lebedev personally tried to pressure me into going along with all this. When they showed up at our house in Denver, and he just knocked on the door, and my wife opened the door, and it was Alexander Lebedev, and she came running and she said, Father Alexander Lebedev's at the front door, as if it was, a burglar or something. And I said, well, Father's gonna let him in. We have to give that poor man dinner. Like, he was driving across the country, and he was he picked up a car for his daughter, and he was driving it back to Los Angeles or something like that. And he wanted to speak with me. And he said, well, Father Stephen, I know you've been agitating against, our rapprochement with the Moscow Patriarchate, and you have to know your place. You're an American, you're not a Russian, this is none of your business, where the people know what's going on. Of course, many Russians were against it, and many converts were for it, so that was a totally bogus argument, right? Then he said, and then he was wearing his cassock and his archpriest cross. The archpriests have a big jeweled cross. He had a big jeweled cross. He said, you see this cross? He said, in the prayer, when they gave me this cross, they read a prayer over me. It said that my job as archpriest is to instruct the other priests. So I'm instructing you to stop making trouble and to go along with what we're doing here and just be quiet and be a good boy, and you'll have a good career in our church. That's the gist of the thing. So this is the Father Alexander Lebedev he's referring to in the article. He's a big, imposing man, very imposing presence, mega intelligent, super intelligent, very professional clergyman. And at some point, they flipped him. I don't know how some people say they had compromising portfolio in his family. I mean, other people, who knows why these men flipped, But he flipped, and he became one of the leading apparatchiki, who were managing this whole, managing this whole process. So it's interesting they sent him, sending him to talk to the old countess in Bulgaria and Romania is a clear message. They're sending the man who is to tell them this is it. And you better go along. We're not backing off on this. They weren't sending a moderating voice. They were sending a man who was fully in the vanguard of the unification with Moscow. Okay. So Metropolitan Cyprian writes to the Russians breaking communion. With inexpressible sorrow, but also with hope of the grace of the Mother of God through the intercessions of St. John Simonovich, the most holy Metropolitan Philaret and all the Russian new martyrs will awaken your patristic zeal, that your Holy Synod might prove once again to be an estimable force, a fortress and fortified city, and a shield and breastplate of orthodoxy in our truly apocalyptic times. You're right about that, Despota, Cyprian. Truly apocalyptic times, as we remain as the least among hierarchs, Metropolitan Cyprian of Oropos and Philaret, President of the Holy Synod in resistance, not the Synod of the Church of Greece, the Synod in resistance. So an important thing to realize about our own union in 2014 when the Cyprianites joined us is that by recognizing the title, the genuine Orthodox, the Church of the Christians of Greece, and our Archbishop as Archbishop of Athens, they have dropped a cardinal point in their old ecclesiology, which that they were not the Synod of the Church of Greece. They were a temporary synod in resistance, and the Synod of the Church of Greece was the new counter-state church. There's no getting around that. There's no getting around that if you read their foundational documents. Okay? So they've renounced that position in order to join us. Okay? In two final letters to the primates of the old calendar churches, which when Lauris addresses them as fellow Orthodox hierarchs, we ask your grace to approach the process of reconciliation of the church in Russia with the understanding and recognition this is an internal matter of the Russian church. That was always the thing. This is an internal matter. This is a Russian matter. See? In other words, this does not affect the universal church. It's just our Russian business, which of course is absurd. Because the Russian church abroad is a beacon of orthodoxy for everyone in the whole world. And by shifting it from we were witnessing to orthodoxy for everyone to this is just a private Russian matter. They're completely avoiding the main questions. Okay. Our earnest convictions lead us to the fact that the process of the rebirth of the church on much suffering homeland at the fall of the godless regime is so firmly rooted and broad by divine mercy we cannot remain on the outside, but must join with it. That was the line, right? We have no intention of abandoning our confession to orthodoxy, before the world. Again I say They've totally abandoned their confession. Nobody cares about them. The Russian church abroad went from being the mouse that roared to the lowest guy in the food chain. I mean, nobody cares what the ROCOR and MP bishops think about anything. Okay, and we will continue to condemn both destructive ecumenism and modernism, which is not true, because when Patriarch Kirill can go hug the Pope, and so then they don't say anything, and then they don't do anything, or if they do it very half-heartedly, and they stay with them, right? With this, the end of the road came. So our author goes on. With this, the end of the road came. The tragic separation of Orthodox Christians from each other was created. The conclusion. So here's conclusion. This conclusion is important because for several reasons. And one is that one person who listened to our class on the internet wrote me and said, how can you say that Subdeacon Nectarius is sympathetic to the old calendarists when he works with Father Peter Heers, who says that we're schismatics? And I wrote back and I said, well, you can be sympathetic to somebody and not agree with them, right? You know, I'm sympathetic to Lefebvreist and sedevacantist old Catholics, but I'm not going to become a Catholic. I'm sympathetic to them. I see their point of view, in other words. This man sees our point of view. But it's more than that. At the end, he's going to say something very interesting. That is not the Peter Heers line. Let's go on. As we can see, the historical relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia and the old calendar churches of Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania were anything but simple. The history extends over 80 years. It's clouded with obscurity, biases from multiple sides, resentment, anger, animosity, sinful passions, different perspectives, major theological and ecclesiological issues, language barriers, buried documents that have either been purposely hidden or accidentally lost. History that has been forgotten by people within the church who have become more ahistorical over the course of a century. However, what has been made clear by the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church is that these Orthodox Christians in the old calendar jurisdictions who are saints stood at the holy altar and shared the most sacred mystery with are just that, they're Orthodox Christians. So he's saying something very important. Our saints, I mean St. John Maximovich, Archbishop of Hierarchal, St. Philaret, stood at the altar with these people. They saw them as fellow bishops. They saw them as fellow Orthodox Christians. Now, he's in ROCOR MP, but he's saying this, right? To hurl accusations, so he's talking to his colleagues in the official churches. To hurl accusations of being schismatic or heretical is contrary to what was put forth by our church fathers of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. So he's saying we should not call them schismatics. Now Peter Heers over and over again tells the people, those old calendars are schismatics. So even though maybe Subdeacon Nectarius works with Father Peter Heers or is part of his team, where they're researching their books and so forth, I don't know what he does with them, but I don't know what their relationship is. But he's saying something. He's saying we're not schismatics. At least if you follow them, if you're consistent in the Russian Church abroad, they're not schismatics. And we should, in the example of our forefathers, strive for unity and peace in Christ Jesus our Lord, in Christ our Lord. Now, how they could be in communion with us and still be in communion with Moscow, I don't know. But because if we joined Moscow again, if we went to communion with those in ecumenism, we would fall under the anathema of 1983. We don't want to do that. You see, so how Subdeacon Nectarius means to strive for unity with us, I have no idea. They can only entice us into following their path of self-destruction, or they can leave that and join us in our witness to the true faith. But you can't. I don't see any other way I don't know what other kind of unity he's talking about. Right. So that's the article. I think it's an extremely valuable article. Bring to light many, and then placing. I mean, most of us have seen bits and pieces of this information, right? But he's laid it out in beautiful. I've only had two criticisms of the article. One that he calls the Union of 2007 a reunification of the Russian Church, which it's not. It was a capitulation of the confessing part of the church that was outside of Russia to a non-canonical and heretical church organization. And the other problem with the article is that he just passes over or doesn't even mention or doesn't draw out the implications of the union with the Cyprianites in 94, which is not a restoration of communion with the Greek Old Calendar Church. It was a newfangled arrangement with a small faction that had an idiosyncratic, uncharacteristic ecclesiology. that the pro-MP forces used in their propaganda campaign to brainwash a critical mass of the Church Abroad people into wanting to be in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. You know, I'm not accusing the Cyprianites of that being their intention, but they were used by Loris and Mark and the pro-MP group, for sure. I mean, there's just no, you can't look at its history and see how it, you get to see it otherwise. Okay. So that's the article. I encourage everybody to read it on the internet and to download it, keep it, and have it in your archives to have some extremely valuable information. And here in our class situation, I just have a printed out copy without a lot of the graphics. But when you're looking at it online, you'll see all the graphics, photographs of people, of documents, and so forth. It's very well done. It's very well done. I appreciate the work that he put into this. And I think I see the hand of Anastasius Hudson in this. Anastasius Hudson is one of our people who's done a biography of Mitron Petros. And I'm wondering if Subject Necarius contacted Anastasius to get advice and leads on pursuing because Anastasius did a tremendous amount of the research behind all this. It's already done. So I imagine Nectarius didn't reinvent the wheel, but I don't know this, but I suppose he went to Anastasius. So you can buy, I think it's on our diocesan website. There's a little ad for Anastasius' book of the biography of Mitron Petros. It's a very valuable thing for us all to have since we belong to the GOC in America, and he's a very important figure. Okay. Any questions or? No? Yes.